Hello everyone. In this video we'll talk about read operations on reading files using C++. And in the previous video we talked about writing to files using C++. And there comes a time where you have just a lot of data and it comes from somewhere and you just need to read it all, right? It might be coming from a database, it might be coming from some device that you're getting data for, and it's big, right? It doesn't have it's not exactly sorted from least to greatest, or it could look totally random. And the best case scenario for you in this situation could be to read that whole data just as a file, right? So in this example I'll be showing reading from a text file and displaying that data. So first I like to start with including the string header file. I'm going to include the vector header file, and then I'm going to include our file. So after we included all of our header files, well, let's actually take a look at the text file that we're going to be reading. Now, I said at the beginning that we'll be dealing with data that could look random, but for this case, we'll be just having a group of numbers that will contain 1 all the way down to 1000. Right, so with these header files right underway, let's get started. I like to start by storing the name of the file as a string. So why don't we do that? And I will call this read data.txt. Right, so here I'm specifying the file name that I'm going to be reading. Here I'm going to be creating my class that's going to be reading the data from the file that I want to open. So because in the previous video we used OF stream to write data, here we're going to be using IF stream for input file stream to read data in. Right, and I'll call this read file. So in the previous video I just used a colon and I used the dot open method to open the file and read it. Here, however, I can do the same thing, but here I'd like to introduce something else. I can provide a file name and I can put the inputs that I would normally put for the open method and actually put them at the creation of the class. Right, so here as soon as I create the right file class, it's going to open readdata.txt and it's gonna open it with the mode of reading the data. Next comes creating a vector, and I'll make it of integers because I know that the data that's inside of readdata.text is going to be integers. And I'll call this data read. So I'll follow the same kind of principles as I did in the last video, and actually I'll do that by saying close. Now that we have that, we can write an if statement to check if read file is open. Oh, fix that for me. Right, so here I have an if statement to check if the file that we're reading is open, right? We call the isOpen method. And if it is open, well, I'll create some temporary value so we can read it in temporarily. And I'll say read file, and I'll use the double angle brackets like I do for cin, and I will read that value into temp value. Right, so this is quite analogous to doing the syntax of reading in values using cin. Right, so it's analogous here. Here we're going to be reading in data. And I'm going to say while we are not at the end of the file. Right, I call the EOF method, and this will return whether we are at the end of the file or not. So I read in a piece of data, and I say, okay, are we at the end of the file already? If we are, we just do nothing. However, if we are not at the end of the file, I'm going to add this data to data read. So I'm going to call the pushback method, and I'm going to add the temp value. Okay, so what this means is that while we are not at the end of the file, whatever value that I just read in, I'm going to store it in my vector. And as with while loops, we'll need to put our changing condition here, and I will read in another value. Right, so here I read in one value, I check if we're at the end of the file. If we're not, we add it to our vector and we read in another file, and we keep checking here. So while we keep checking, I'm going to push the temporary value into my vector, and then here I read another one, check if we're at the end of the file. If we're not, while we are not at the end, I'm going to keep adding values to my vector that I have called data read, and I'm going to keep asking for new values. So once we reach the end of the file, then we're good. We don't have to do much. That's it. So here, I want to have an else statement just in case there's some problems with opening the file. Now we'll say could not open file name and print a new line, and that's it. Right, if we couldn't open it, well, that's it. So what this code does is that it opens a file and we read in the data. Right, we read in the data, and while we are not at the end of the file, we put it into a vector of integers. So after we open up the data and we read it into this vector, we need to see what are the contents of the data, right? It doesn't make sense to read in all this data and to not use it, right? So here what I'll do is that once we've opened the data, I'm going to check if the data read size is greater than 0, right? This is the case if were we able to read some data in, right? Is there valid data inside of the text file? Well, if there is, what I'll do is I'll use a for loop, so that way I can iterate through the data. And we can print it out. Here I'll use a space to space everything out. Oops. And finally here I'll use standard cout and print a new line. Right, so here in this body of code, this means, well, if we're able to read in data from our file, we'll print everything out, it will be space separated, and we'll print a new line. So why don't we build to see if you have any syntax errors. Okay, build succeeded, we're good. Now if we run it, and we check right here, we see all of the data that's here that we read from the file. We were able to successfully load it onto the vector, and here we print it all. Since a size of 1000 is definitely greater than 0, we printed everything. Thanks for watching this video. In the next one, what we'll do is that we'll cover a program that can write to a file and then read from a file, all in the same program.